Right now, 5 massive tankers carrying 3.4 million barrels of oil are drifting aimlessly in the ocean, rejected by the very ports they were promised to. This isn't just a shipping error. It's the result of a $120 billion geopolitical gamble. After saving $13 billion on cheap Russian crude, India has suddenly pulled the plug, leaving Russia with no choice but to fire sale its black gold to China for a record-shattering $35 a barrel. But why would India walk away from the deal of the century? And is this the moment Putin's economic lifeline finally snaps? Let's look at the secret bill that changed everything. Imagine standing on the coast of Gujarat, India, looking out at the horizon in late December 2025. Normally, you'd see a steady line of tankers moving into the ports like clockwork. But instead, something eerie happened. 5 massive ships, the giants of the ocean, suddenly came to a dead halt. These tankers were carrying 3.4 million barrels of Russian Sokol and Urals crude oil. To give you an idea of the scale, that is enough oil to fill about 215 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Under normal circumstances, these ships would dock, unload their black gold, and the refineries would turn it into the gasoline and diesel that powers India's massive economy. But this time, the ports stayed closed. The orders were cancelled mid-voyage. For over 10 days, these ships sat stranded on the high seas, burning fuel just to stay in place, while their captains waited for instructions that never came. This wasn't a technical glitch or a weather delay. It was the first visible crack in a multi-billion-dollar friendship. India, which had spent the last 3 years becoming Russia's most loyal customer, had suddenly gone silent. For Russia, this was a disaster. Oil isn't like a pair of shoes you can keep in a warehouse. It's expensive to store, and even more expensive to move. With every hour those ships sat idle, Russia was losing millions. The ghost fleet was a clear signal to the world. The rules of the game had just changed, and Russia was about to find out exactly how much its cheap oil was actually going to cost them. To understand why those ships were rejected, we first have to look at just how sweet the deal was before it went sour. For the past few years, India and Russia were essentially in an economic honeymoon phase. While the rest of the world was turning its back on Russian energy due to the conflict in Ukraine, India saw a massive opportunity. Think of it like a clearance sale at a luxury store. Western sanctions meant Russia had a massive surplus of oil and very few people willing to buy it. India stepped in and said, "We'll take it, but only if the price is right." And the price was very right. In 2024 alone, India imported 232 million tons of crude oil, and nearly 38% of that came from Russia. By choosing Russian Urals crude over more expensive alternatives from the Middle East, India saved an estimated $13.5 billion in just 1 year. That is enough money to fund India's entire space program several times over. For India, this wasn't about politics. It was about math. Cheap energy meant lower costs for factories, cheaper fuel for cars, and a massive boost to the national budget. For Russia, this was their lifeline. They were exporting over 250 million barrels a year, bringing in roughly $150 billion in total energy revenue. This cash flow is what kept the Russian economy from collapsing under the weight of Western sanctions. India became the big buyer that kept the lights on in Moscow. But, as the saying goes, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. While India was busy counting its savings, a massive problem was brewing in the background. One that didn't involve ships or oil, but the very money being used to pay for it. While saving $13 billion sounds like a dream, the way India was paying for that oil quickly turned into a nightmare for Russia. Imagine you're a store owner and your best customer pays you thousands of dollars, but only in a store credit that can only be spent inside their own shop. At first, you're happy, but then you realize the shop only sells things you don't need, or things you can already make yourself. Suddenly, that money is just useless paper sitting in your desk. This is exactly what happened between Russia and India. Because of Western sanctions, Russia couldn't easily accept US dollars or euros. So they tried using India's currency, the rupee. But there was a massive problem. Russia was selling India $50 billion worth of oil, but India was only selling Russia about $5 billion worth of goods in return. This left Russia with a $45 billion surplus of rupees every year. And here is the kicker. The rupee is partially convertible, meaning Russia couldn't just take those billions to a bank in Switzerland or Dubai and swap them for gold or dollars. They were stuck with mountains of Indian currency. Russia essentially told India, "We have enough rupees to buy every Indian tractor and sack of rice for the next decade. We need something we can actually use." To solve this, Russia began demanding that India pay in the Chinese yuan. This was a huge ego blow to India. India and China are major rivals, and the last thing the Indian government wanted to do was help make China's currency more powerful. However, the hunger for cheap oil was so strong that India's biggest refineries eventually caved. They started buying yuan just to pay Putin. It was a messy, uncomfortable compromise. But just as they thought they had the payment issues figured out, a new player entered the game, and he wasn't interested in compromises. While India was busy figuring out how to pay Russia in Chinese yuan, the United States was preparing a massive economic reality check. On August 6, 2025, U.S. President Trump signed an executive order that hit the Indian economy like a sledgehammer. The order slapped an additional 25% tariff on certain Indian goods. When you added this to the existing trade taxes, the total tariff for many Indian products suddenly skyrocketed to 50%. To put that in perspective, imagine you own a factory in India that makes high-end shirts. You sell them to a shop in New York for $20. Suddenly, because of this new law, the shop owner has to pay $10 extra in taxes just to bring your shirt into the country. Overnight, your product becomes too expensive for American shoppers, and your orders vanish. This policy didn't just hit a few small businesses, it targeted the very heart of India's export economy, industries like textiles, jewelry, and fisheries. These are sectors that employ millions of people but operate on very thin profit margins. When the U.S., India's largest trading partner, effectively doubled the cost of doing business, it put $120 billion worth of trade at immediate risk. The White House was very blunt about why they did this. They stated that India's purchase of Russian oil was directly fueling the war machine in Ukraine. The message was clear. If you take blood oil from Russia, we will take your profits from America. For the Indian government, the math was no longer simple. Yes, they were saving $13 billion on cheap oil, but they were now on the verge of losing $120 billion in trade. It was a classic trap. And as 2025 came to a close, the U.S. was about to tighten the trap even further with a new piece of legislation that made tariffs look like a slap on the wrist. If the 50% tariffs were a warning shot, the Russia Oil Profit Reduction Act of 2025, also known as the DROP Act, was the nuclear option. Introduced in December 2025, this wasn't just another tax. It was a financial death sentence for anyone caught trading with Russia. Up until this point, most sanctions only applied to U.S. or European companies. But this new bill introduced secondary sanctions. This means the U.S. government essentially told the world, you don't have to be an American company to be punished. If you help Russia sell its oil, we will treat you like the enemy. The bill gave the U.S. president the power to impose a staggering 500% tariff on any goods coming from a country that knowingly buys Russian oil. Imagine a $50,000 Indian-made machine suddenly costing $250,000 just to clear customs in New York. It would instantly destroy India's export industry. But the bill went even deeper. It targeted the banking system. If an Indian bank facilitated a payment for Russian crude, that bank could be banned from the U.S. dollar system. Since almost all international trade is done in dollars, being banned is like being kicked off the internet. You can still work, but you can't communicate or do business with anyone outside your own house. For India's energy giants like Reliance and Indian Oil Corporation, the choice was terrifying. They could keep buying Russia's cheap oil and save a few $1 million, but in exchange, they would lose access to the entire American market and the global financial system. It was no longer a deal, it was a trap. This is the exact moment the 5 tankers we talked about earlier were told, do not dock. Turn around. We cannot take this oil. By mid-December 2025, Russia was in a state of absolute panic. Those 3.4 million barrels of oil were still floating in the ocean, rejected by India and costing millions in parking fees every single day. Russia couldn't just sail them back to Siberia. The cost of the return trip and the lack of storage space meant they had to sell, and they had to sell now. Russia turned to the only other buyer big enough to handle that volume, China. But, China isn't just a buyer. They are perhaps the world's toughest negotiators. They knew Russia was cornered. They knew the Indian ports were closed. And they knew the United States was watching. So China made an offer that was practically an insult. They demanded a discount of $35 per barrel. To understand how insane that is, global oil was trading at roughly $60 to $70. Selling it at $35 means Russia was essentially giving it away at a price that barely covered the cost of digging it out of the ground and shipping it across the globe. By the time the deal was signed, this single batch of oil was $68 million cheaper than it would have been just a month earlier. China effectively saved enough money on this one fire sale to build several high-tech hospitals. For Russia, it was a commercial bloodbath. They were losing billions of dollars every month, and their federal budget, which they had planned around a price of $69 per barrel, was now facing a massive $100 billion deficit. Russia had hoped that by pivoting to Asia, they would be immune to Western pressure. But by December 2025, they realized the truth. When your only two customers know you're desperate, you aren't a partner, you're a target for a bargain. Once India realized that Russian oil was now toxic to their relationship with the US, they didn't just stop buying, they executed one of the fastest strategic pivots in energy history. India's leaders knew they couldn't just leave their gas stations empty, so they had to find a new energy family immediately. In the first quarter of 2026, Indian refineries placed massive orders for roughly 24 million barrels of crude oil from a completely different direction: the Americas. Instead of looking north to Russia, they looked west to the United States, Guyana, and Brazil. At the same time, they reopened their old checkbooks with the Middle East, ramping up imports from traditional partners like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But here is the catch. This oil is not cheap. Unlike Russia, which was selling at a desperate discount, these countries sell at the full market price. India is now paying what experts call the compliance premium. They are essentially choosing to pay billions of dollars more for oil just to ensure their exports. Those $120 billion worth of textiles and electronics can enter the US market without being hit by a 50% or even 500% tariff. This move proved that India's loyalty was never to Moscow. It was to its own growth. By dumping Russian oil, India sent a clear message to the world. We will take your cheap prices while they last, but we will not sink our entire economy to save yours. For Russia, this was honestly the ultimate betrayal. They had lost their biggest growth market, and now they were left with a massive supply of oil and almost no one left to buy it, except for one last very demanding neighbor. As we stand here in early 2026, the global energy map has been completely redrawn. The 5 tankers that were stranded off the coast of India are gone, sold off to China at a price that barely covers the cost of the fuel used to move them. But for Russia, the real crisis is just beginning. With India, its most reliable growth market, now drastically cutting back to save its relationship with the US, Russia is facing a terrifying reality. They are running out of big buyers. While China and smaller nations like Pakistan and Brazil are still taking some barrels, they aren't doing it out of friendship. They are doing it because they can smell blood in the water. They know Russia has to sell, and they are using that leverage to drive prices down to levels that are literally bankrupting the Russian state budget. Experts project that, by the end of 2026, Russia's oil and gas revenues could drop to just 23% of their national budget, a staggering fall from the 50% they enjoyed just a few years ago. The special and privileged partnership with India is being tested by the cold, hard reality of global trade. India is moving toward the future, joining US-led high-tech initiatives like Pax Silica and securing its silicon and semiconductor supply chains, while Russia is left trying to sell 20th-century fuel to anyone willing to risk a tariff. So, this leaves us with the ultimate question: who is left to buy Russia's oil? If the world's largest democracy has decided that the discount isn't worth the danger, can Russia's economy survive on China's leftovers alone? Or are we witnessing the final days of oil being used as a geopolitical weapon? If you found this breakdown of the $120 billion oil gamble insightful, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're tracking these global shifts every week to keep you ahead of the curve. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.